Okay, folks, dark tourism or thanatourism. These are expressions that have been used to describe any tourism that has to do with death or places of suffering, which sounds like a pretty grisly subject, but I think by the end of this lecture, you'll find that most of the tourism that we talk about has something to do with these subjects. First of all, though, there have been lots of different definitions of what we mean by these, so we'll look at those. First of all, what we're going to do, we're trying to understand the attraction of death and war as tourist attractions, and to understand the specific management issues raised by what is obviously such a very, very, very sensitive subject. Because remember, with all of these, there's always at least two sides, often many, many more. So dark tourism has been defined as visitations to places where tragedies or historically noteworthy death has occurred and continue to impact our lives. And that's a photograph of Gallipoli. So that, for a start, is a place that, obviously for Australians and for Turkish people as well, is a very, very important site. And it does still impact people's lives. Think about the number of tourists who actually go to visit Gallipoli on their trips around Europe, etc. So it's human nature. This is not a new phenomenon. It's not something that's just happened within the last few years that people have been interested in death and suffering. Throughout history, people have gone to places of public execution. They've gone to look at places of horror, really. Sometimes they think of it as being educational or enlightening. Sometimes it's just ghoulish voyeurism. And sometimes it's sadistic or masochistic tendencies that are taking people to these places. Foley and Lennon, they came up with the definition of dark tourism as being the phenomenon which encompasses the presentation or consumption by visitors of real and commodified death and disaster sites. So they've extended this. It's not the real places. It's actually also these commodified sites such as the London Dungeon, which is in this photograph, which is a completely false site. It's under the railway bridges at London Bridge, but it shows things about torture and all about the horrible stories about Jack the Ripper and the murders that have happened in London, etc. And it draws people in, and it tells true stories, but it's certainly the site itself is certainly just a false site. And you sit on one of these rides as you go through, and it's a bit like a theme park. And so, how much respect are you paying to those stories and the people who died? So dark tourism does have its slightly unorthodox, slightly unpleasant side to it. And then in 1996, Seaton he coined this phrase thanatourism, and he described it as travel to a location wholly or partially motivated by the desire for actual or symbolic encounters with death, particularly but not exclusively violent death, gets worse, which may to a varying degree be activated by the person-specific features of those whose deaths are its focal objects. So what he is actually saying is that rather than just going and looking at these sites as an observer, it is also, you're going and looking at it to a certain extent because of the behaviour of the tourists themselves. And very often with thanatourism, the visitor themselves has some connection to that site. Or they can make some personal connection in some way. So it is slightly different from just the area of dark tourism, which, if you like, is all-encompassing for this sort of tourism. So as far as Seaton's concerned, thanatourism is behaviour. The concept's defined by the traveller's motives rather than attempting to specify the features of the destination. And secondly, thanatourism is not an absolute. It works on a continuum based on two. And this is that continuum. So you can see over on the left-hand side is weak thanatourism element. The interest in death is person-centered and exists with other motivations. So it's about the person who died and the person who is the visitor. Remember, both of them are involved in this. The dead are known to and valued by the visitor. So they could be personally known. Or this could be seen in something like the visit to a war memorial commemorating a dead relative. It could even be seen to some extent in the people who come here to Tasmania and who go to Port Arthur because they know that they have convict ancestors once upon a time. But it is the way that the person themselves and the visitor themselves connects to that site and wants to go and commemorate the person whose story it is that is being told. The strong thanatourism element tends to be more interest in death, is generalized, and exists as the sole motivator. So that person is far more interested in perhaps the method of death, visiting perhaps somewhere like the penitentiary, as I know some of you have done, and thinking about people being hung in a prison of that nature, interested in the form of death more so than the actual stories of the people who are put to death. Fascination with death is irrespective of the person or persons involved, so it's far more the destination that you're interested in. This might be more akin perhaps to people visiting the sites of the Holocaust in Germany, the concentration camps, where they're not Jewish, they don't know any of the people who are involved in that, but they're going because it's the destination and it's that whole story about the destination as opposed to necessarily about the individuals. So this could be visits to graveyards or catacombs or scenes of disaster. So it's a visit to a death event, if you like, rather than doing it on a more personal level. As far as Wikipedia is concerned, they have sort of merged dark tourism and thanatourism because they are so close as descriptions, although dark tourism is a much broader term. And they say dark tourism is thanatourism, or thanatourism is tourism involving travel to sites associated with death and suffering. This includes sites of pilgrimage, such as the site of St. Peter's death in Rome, castles and battlefields, such as Culloden near Inverness, Scotland, sites of disaster, either natural or man-made, such as Ground Zero in New York, prisons now open to the public, such as Beaumaris Prison in Anglesey, and purpose-built centres, such as the London Dungeon. So they're including all of them. In a class of its own, one of the most notorious destinations for dark tourism is the Nazi extermination camp at Auschwitz in Poland. This tendency may have an ancient evolutionary origin among man's ancestors, aiding survival. If there's a death that affects the tribe, this instinctive tendency pushes the survivors to find all they can about what happened, to try to help them to avoid getting into that danger again. This last part is one of those problems that you get with Wikipedia, in that anybody can put in definitions in Wikipedia. I have not come across any research, academic research, that actually proves this last point, but it could be true that it is that survival element that people want to know what's happened in the past, and if you know about the atrocities of what's happened before, then you'll make sure that it doesn't happen again. And there is some truth in that. But as I say, the way that this is written here, sort of affecting the tribe, etc., isn't particularly academic. But it's probably one method of describing why people are so curious about this sort of tourism, about this sort of phenomenon. Actually, death isn't a phenomenon, it's a... So, included in dark tourism, there's a whole range of different things. That's a photograph of the Anzac beaches in Gallipoli, so one of those places that tourists still go to, although I think there's a big road through there now. So we have battlefields, Gallipoli, the Somme, etc. Memorials, such as the Canberra War Memorial. Heritage sites, places like castles over in the UK. I think probably the most grisly of all stories was the story of Berkeley Castle and Edward II. And Edward II was done away with by his wife, Isabel, the she-wolf of France. And it was probably the most grisly death in any of English history. I don't know if you know the story. But basically, she wanted to get rid of him because she wanted basically to be ruler, not that that would have ever happened. And she wanted to leave no sign of outward violence on the outside of his body. She wanted it to look as if it had been a death by natural causes. So They took him off to Berkeley Castle, where they strapped him down in a dark and deep and dingy dungeon. They took a red-hot poker, and they... Yes, I can see by the expressions on all your faces. So that there was no sign of violence on the outside of his body. Anyway, leave it to your grisly imaginations, but I tell you, the number of people that want to go and see that dark, dank and dingy dungeon at Berkeley Castle is quite extraordinary. He did die, and there was no cause of, no look as if it looked like he died under normal circumstances, but nobody liked Isabella, so she met a, well, not that grisly an end, but later. Anyway, so that's like the heritage site and torture sites, going to visit the torture chambers in an old castle. Prisons and penal colonies, we've got plenty of them. Maria, Sarah, Arthur, all of them here in Tasmania. And then there's also places like the old prison in Melbourne, for example, the old Melbourne jail. Sites of terrorism. Belfast is a place that was, certainly during all of my growing up years, a place of terrorism, and people now will still go to Belfast. Obviously, it's much, much safer. There's been a lot of redevelopment that's been going on at Belfast, but there's still the paintings on the walls that were to do, both the Catholics and the Protestants had painted these huge, great big murals. There's a big discussion about what's happening to the site of the old Maze prison that was there. These were all, if you like, I'm English, so I would say it's a focus of terrorism. My husband, who's from Belfast, would say it was all to do with civil war and the struggle against the English. So you can take either side, and that's just it with terrorism. Of course, terrorism, the most obvious one in our time is the World Trade Center. And then war, and we'll look at war tourism as we go through this lecture today. But we're fighting a war in Iraq at the moment. Fighting the war on terror. We're also, you're thinking about people who perhaps your fathers or grandfathers might have fought in Vietnam. There are still people alive today who are very involved in serious wars during our lifetime. So we'll look at that later. There's also the behaviour of dark tourists and what they do to actually undergo these sort of events. And as you can see, it's happened for many, many years. People travelling to witness public enactments of death. Gladiators going and, thumbs up or thumbs down. Was he going to be saved or go for the chop? They're going to finish him off. In your ancient Roman stadiums, a couple of thousand years ago. Executions. Think about the women sitting doing their knitting next to the scaffold site in Paris as they were chopping off people's heads. Or chopping off people's heads in England, and everybody arrived and came out for a good old, bit of sightseeing. Public hangings, certainly in England, what is now called Marble Arch used to be called Tyburn, and at Tyburn stood the Tyburn tree, at which you could hang 40 people at once. Saved on getting a hangman, you only needed one, and that was 40 of them dispatched. It's also one of those sort of sites that people will go and see today. Today we gaze at car crashes. That is dark tourism. I used to, when I was guiding, take coachloads of people on so many roads, invariably we saw some pretty nasty car crashes. And I actually used to say, right, the sickies can go on the left where the car crash is, or on the right, and the others of you can sit on the left and avoid it. And people did. They used to get out their cameras. Things like ship and ferry sinkings and terrorist explosions. Certainly, I know in London, when we were being routinely bombed by the IRA, there were lots of buildings that were damaged that people would want to go and actually have a look at. It was very hard when you're trying to avoid talking about the subject. But then think about what's happened at 9/11 and think about how 9/11 and Ground Zero has almost become a spiritual site of pilgrimage for people going to New York to go and visit, even if they didn't know anybody who was in that building or had no connection whatsoever with that event. The fact that it was put on TV and brought into your own sitting room and has been replayed ad nauseum ever since has actually made that personal connection. Travel to see sites of individual or mass deaths after they've occurred, places like Auschwitz or battlefield sites, or the Ned Kelly gallows. People go and see that. They've heard the story, they know the myth, they want to see the proof of it. Visits to internment sites and memorials, graveyards, catacombs, war memorials, cenotaphs, or partaking in or observing representations of particular deaths in locations unassociated with the occurrence, the waxworks museums, for example. And used to go to Madame Tussauds, to the Chamber of Horrors, and frighten people. Reenactments of battles. We talked previously about how attractions, actually that was in Foundations B, but how attractions can be all sorts of things and to do with heritage. Very often these days it's to do with reenactments. Or even passion plays. Plenty of blood and guts on the stage in a passion play. Rojek has also, outside of dark tourism and thanatourism, identified black spots as places of tourism. That's the tunnel in Paris where Princess Diana died, and which people have continued to visit. So commercial developments of grave sites and sites in which celebrities or large numbers of peoples have met with sudden and violent death. Just some examples for you. We have obviously the Twin Towers. The other one at the top is JFK's convoy just before he was shot. Down at the bottom on the left, the big house. Can anybody tell me what that is? Anybody hazard a guess? It's Graceland. It's where Elvis Presley lived and died. It is also can be included in this idea of thanatourism or dark tourism. And then we have Diana again down in the corner there. But even places, like going to see the skulls in Cambodia from the horrors of Pol Pot, going to see where people were beheaded on the Tower of London. And you stand up there and you talk about the 6 people who were beheaded inside the tower. And 5 of them were women, which is why they were beheaded inside and not on Tower Hill, which is outside the tower, in public, so that it could be a spectacle and a cause for a day off for most people. Even ancient battlefields, such as visiting Troy, you'll find that people will go and visit that. So, and visiting cemeteries, great thing. If you go to a new place, there's lots of stories that can be learned by visiting cemeteries. And it has been going on for an awfully long time. Pilgrims travel to see the sites of religious martyrdom in the Dark Ages. People went to Rome to see the chains of St. Peter. They're still there in the church in Rome. People travelled to sites where saints had been put to death and miracles had occurred. Battles such as Waterloo in 1815 were watched from a safe distance by members of the nobility. I'm so pleased it was a safe distance. And this painting is a painting of Waterloo. That was as close as you got to the TV in those days. And one of the earliest battle sites of the American Civil War, Manassas, was sold the next day as a visitor attraction site. So not only have we always been interested in sites of death and atrocity and suffering, but it's been recognised for a long time that this is the case, and that people will then want to go and visit these sites and do their bit of sightseeing, etc. So it's all been happening for a long time. There are overlaps, of course, with other types of tourism when we're talking about dark tourism. Do you like my particularly tasteless cartoon? That question, it overlaps with heritage tourism. Whose history? Whose history are you going to tell? Particularly if you're talking about a subject like this where there are normally at least 2 sides. So, whose story? Are you going to take a side? Are you right to do that? What's your reason for doing that? Whose decision? Whose decision is it to make this site a tourist site? There are sites such as battlefields, etc. in the UK where there is perhaps just a small stone plaque in a farmer's field. Certainly out on the moors around York, which was the site of, like Marston Moor, the site of a lot of battles during the Civil War, Well, you really have to be a Civil War aficionado, very, very interested in 17th century British history to actually want to go and find these sites. And fields farmed, and yeah, he keeps turning up bones, human ones, but it's good for the calcium, good for whatever is planted there. But that's all there is, just this tiny little stone monument that said this is the site. Is that enough? Whose decision was it that that should be all there would be, and not a great big mega centre called, Civil War theme park? Cultural tourism, it overlaps with cultural tourism as well, and how we are interested in knowing about each other's cultures. And adventure tourism, visits to places considered to be dangerous, and this would be your tourist now wanting perhaps to go and have a holiday in Iraq. Let's see what's going on over there. So, as I say, there's overlaps a lot with a lot of other sorts of different types of tourism. And it's the operators of these sites that are really becoming the custodians of history, because it is those people who are deciding which is the story that they're actually going to push. So, which parts of history do you choose to interpret and commemorate? And which do you choose to leave out? Everybody goes on about the Jewish Holocaust in Germany during the Second World War, but there have been many, many, many other holocausts and genocides in history. The Sinti Holocaust, the genocide of the American Indians. I'm very ashamed to say that back in 1301, in York in England, Edward I stuffed a whole load of all the Jewish people who lived in York into Clifford's Tower and set it on fire. It was the first genocide, or not the first, but just another form of clearing out a people that you didn't want. So, there's a lot of horror back there, but where is all of this being memorialized? Who decides which bits you specifically need to remember? So coverage is selective, motivated by the need to increase visitation and revenue rather than presenting an undistorted view of history. Is that a truly cynical look, or is that the truth? I think we have to question that as we go through. Dark tourism sites are important testaments to the consistent failure of humanity to temper our worst excesses, and managed well, they can help us learn from the darkest elements of our past. But we have to guard against the voyeuristic and exploitative streak that is evident at so many of them. And this again comes round to that question of respect, and respect for the situation and the events that have created this place as a place of visitation, and we have to remove the voyeuristic element. So the motivations to visit, to watch death, public hangings or executions, that's my worst nightmare. To go and see places after death has occurred. These are the 5 categories of activities related up to death. But travel to internment sites, travel to reenactments, travel to synthetic sites, which we've looked at all before. But I wonder whether these are really motivations, as Seaton says, or whether they're just a description of what you do if you're undertaking dark tourism. I think they're very descriptive. We also have atrocity as tourist attractions identified by Tunbridge and Ashworth. And this is really looking at the elements of what it is that attracts. So as opposed to going and looking at places that cruelty has happened, it's actually the nature of cruelty which is going to call people in, because they just can't believe that somebody could be that cruel. So the nature of cruelty favours unusual or the spectacular. The nature of the victims, characterised by innocence, vulnerability, and the non-complicit activity within that whatever's happened, the event itself. I think that this is probably one of the things to do with the Holocaust, because mostly the Jewish people involved there were seen as being innocent victims. It wasn't their fault, and yet they were caught up in this dreadful event. Numbers, places where huge numbers of people have been put to death. And numbers become a tourist attraction only because human imagination has difficulty extending sympathies to small groups. Maybe that is why the German Holocaust has become so important, and so many others, such as those in Rwanda, etc., have been forgotten or ignored. The nature of the perpetrators should be unambiguously identified and distinguishable from the victims. in a situation like this, when we're talking about dark tourism, you have to have the goodies and the baddies. You cannot merge that. It's no good saying that these people who created this dreadful event were actually okay. They just made a mistake once. So the nature of the perpetrators can also be an attraction. Goodness, is this where these dreadful people lived? High profile visibility of the original event. So there needs to be some authenticity here. You need to go to the right place. And survival of records. And you find that this is a lot of museums, etc., might well have a section of that museum which has been handed over to dealing with this form of tourism. And a lot of that's to do with the survival of records, that you will go and you will see the lampshade made of human skin. You will go and see somebody's papers that was all that they had left. You'll go and see the clothes that they wore before they were put to death or whatever it is. So there's survival of records. It is also a way of authenticating these dreadful, dreadful events that are now so important as tourist sites. Getting slightly less depressing, nostalgia is also a very big part of visiting sites and of dark tourism itself. And Boym has come up with several different types of forms of nostalgia. He says that nostalgia should really be split into these two different types, restorative and reflexive. Restorative is what you do to get into this nostalgic state or to try and overcome nostalgia. Whereas reflexive is the emotional effect that it's actually going to have on you. So types of nostalgia, things like stress, etc. Restorative is that you go home, whereas reflexive is perhaps the longing for the time before. And stress does happen at these sites. People get quite stressful and quite anxious about visiting sites of this type before they actually get there, because particularly if they don't know what to expect, particularly if they do have some sort of personal connection with this dark tourism site. The push for homecoming is another of the types that he recognizes. You've been there and you've experienced it, now you just really want to get away. So your action is that you go straight away, whereas the emotional side is perhaps that you will sit and think and perhaps have some sort of meditative or spiritual emotional connection with the place. Very often with these dark tourism sites, you'll find that there are places for quiet contemplation, or perhaps places for prayer that are set aside within them. The way it thinks of itself within dark tourism. Restorative, the action one, truth and tradition. It's the sort of place that is actually going to make you feel that you've got the whole story. Perhaps it might also, depending what the place is, it might instill some pride in you, particularly if it was somewhere such as Gallipoli, where you can go and you can see the site itself, and you know the truth, and you know the story, and you know the braveness of the people who fought there, and it has an effect on you that, it's truth, it's tradition, and you're proud of it. Whereas the reflexive side and the emotional side faces modernity, so that's far more likely to be looking at the waste in human terms, and just how awful it must have been to have been landed on those beaches and not to be able to get off, if we're talking about Gallipoli, for example. Dealing with absolutes, because with dark tourism and with something that is as absolute as death, there are absolutes involved in this. So restorative protects the absolute truth. You are going to want the authentic. You don't want it to be flowery. You don't want somebody to try and pull the wool over your eyes. You don't want the story to be made more acceptable. You want the truth. Whereas your emotional questions the absolute truth. Can it really be like that? Can it really have been as bad as that? Was there nothing that could be done to change this situation? So you're questioning it. Politics comes into dark tourism. Within politics, you get the restorative is the national revivals. Again, going back to that thing about pride. and reflective how to inhabit two places at one time. Very often, how can we reconcile the fact that these people who created these awful things so many years ago are really the forefathers for the people who we now have leading us today? How do you reconcile that? The emphasis for dark tourism within the restorative side is on symbols. It is on that monument. It is on the straightness of the line of graves within a war cemetery, for example. It is symbols. Symbols of what happened that you can hook into, that you can understand. Whereas the reflexive and the emotional side is far more on details. You want to know everything about it. Memory, national and linear memory. Again, to do with dark tourism, the national memory. This is the national story. This is what happened. This is the story, for example, it's told every 25th of April when we commemorate the Anzacs at Gallipoli. And linear, in other words, it follows a line. It follows a story line all the way through. Whereas the emotional side is far more social. It's far more to do with the personal and very varied. You're going to be hopping around through that story. And plots, the restorative to restore national origins and conspiracy theories, and reflexive is past is dealt with irony and humour. So these places affect each of us differently, and each place and story affects each of us in a very different way. It's all to do with your own connections to the place. So dark tourism does not aim to leave the tourist cold and purely interested. It really wants to reach out and to touch that tourist and to make those connections with that tourist. And I quite like this. Not all history is dark tourism, but all dark tourism is history. And that is very, very true. So, as I say, nostalgia is a very important part of dark tourism because it's how you react to this dreadful event that's taken place there. So it's almost, if you like, it's almost a form of virtual tourism because you're not there witnessing the events, you're only witnessing them secondhand through history. So when we look at virtual tourism versus dark tourism, we can see that virtual tourism becomes almost every day, whereas dark tourism is the connection with the past events and with evil, basically. So is it reality-based? Dark tourism isn't. Dark tourism is. Virtual tourism isn't. Virtual tourism comes through this stimulata. It's a simulation, if you like, of the event that took place there, and perhaps objects that are going to stimulate the story and stimulate you as the visitor to trying to understand that story. Whereas with dark tourism, yes, it is reality-based. It is something dreadful that happened. Even if it's something like a simulated site such as the London Dungeon, the stories that are told there really happened, so there is some reality within them. Is it site-specific? No, virtual tourism can happen anywhere, as we'll see when we look at the Holocaust Memorial in Washington, D.C. But dark tourism, yes, it is site-specific, that it happens in that place, that you go to the battle site, that you go to visit the castle where somebody was tortured, etc. Is it themed? Yes, both are themed. Both will tell a specific story, because perhaps the story is too big to tell all sides. Reality, virtual tourism, none. It might touch on reality, but the way it's told, you cannot trust it to be an authentic side. And dark tourism is total reality. The feeling of being involved in the process, yes, with virtual tourism, because you will be there, being involved, it's interactive, that's the whole thing about it. Whereas with dark tourism, it's the real sense of involvement, that you are the next generation on and you're looking back into history to see these horrors of what's happened in the past. And fabricated, yeah, virtual tourism can be fabricated, but dark tourism most certainly can't. And it's really virtual tourism has really hugely taken off. And it's really thanks to things like CSI, Midsummer Murders that was on the other night. It is bringing these horrific events into your own sitting room and giving you a familiarity with them, which in a normal world without TV you would never ever have had. So it's the effect of media, if you like, creating this sort of virtual tourism, which is different from dark. So why do dark tourists do it? Well, perhaps it says more about us than what happened in the past. A pretext to understand our own age. If you like, it is a way of pilgrimage that you go and visit the past so you can understand more about what's happening today, to explain how you got to the current situation, whether it's in a political context or whatever. And not only to learn from the past, but to carry the message forward, and perhaps by doing that, creating a better future. So, to a certain extent, the pretext to understand our own age is almost an educational motivation for taking part in dark tourism. Romanticism, often found at battle sites or places of torture. Very often it's that romantic notion of the warrior of the past fighting a noble cause and winning or losing. More often than not losing if it's dark tourism. There's a romantic story and a romantic myth that's been built around these dreadful events. But it's what you understand, so you actually go and have a look and have this romantic notion. Barbarism. To feel superior to the perpetrators of the crime. The people who did anything like that must have been completely and utterly barbaric. I'm so pleased we don't live in a time like that had no civilization. So it's almost really feeling superior. But at the same time, not understanding how humans can be so cruel to each other, and really feeling a great deal of compassion for the victims. Because barbarism is really where you've separated the goodies from the baddies. So you're hating and feeling superior to the baddies, but you are feeling very compassionate towards the goodies. Part of a national identity. And the message from that is, although we have suffered, we have prevailed. And this, I think, is very much the case with things like Gallipoli. Yes, it was a dreadful battle. Yes, it was a dreadful time in Australian history. But you have prevailed and you have come out and you are stronger for it. Remembering that Gallipoli was really the first time that Australia went to war as Australia itself, as opposed to being as part of the British Empire. So that was a very important battle and a very important war, because it was a decision that was made by Australians for Australians about how it affected Australians, as opposed to it necessarily being something that you do as part of a commonwealth or as a colony of a different country a very long way away. So part of a national identity is certainly a good example of Gallipoli as far as Australia is concerned. And a sign of decadence, how others mistreated the current ruling group. In other words, this is where you tend to find things like visits to ghettos, where there was a great deal of cruelty. And to a certain extent, it's those people from the ghettos who've now graduated and become the political leaders of today. And so it's a case of looking at where they've come from and seeing where they've got to. Or it could be a case of going and seeing great palaces and these, wonderful old, very elegant buildings next door to places of great poverty and cruelty, such as ghettos. And you wonder how one people could treat one group in one way, and yet they had all this sort of decadent lifestyle and great riches and wealth. To some, it can be a mystical experience. So this, again, is, as I was saying, going and visiting Ground Zero and really just sort of standing there. Sense of mysticism and awe, and a real sort of connection with the spot itself. You're standing there. And then a spiritual experience. This almost steps a step further from the mystical. The mystical is about almost a sort of magical or inspiring experience, whereas the spiritual experience is really the effect that it has on the observer itself. And it's this sort of feeling of humanity and feeling of compassion, and feeling that when you have experienced this, you are going to walk away as a different person, that you've learned something from it. And this, again, is one of the other motivations for tourism. So there are four basic emotions that are play and sort of interact with the psychology of dark tourists. And that's a sense of insecurity, a sense of gratitude, a sense of humility, and feelings of superiority that come out of all of this. What time is it, folks? Right, we're going to have a break. Off we go for 10 minutes, then we'll talk about war tourism. Okay, guys, so war tourism. Of course, war tourism is very, very closely associated with dark tourism. Look, the definition of tourism. Tourism is the temporary movement and relocation of people away from their normal place of living to destinations where they participate in non-ordinary activities and behaviour. Yeah, you agree with that? That's what tourists do. But it's also a description of what armies do when they go to war. They leave their bases, they travel to a destination, and they engage in non-ordinary activities, shooting people. So they're very, very close, unfortunately. And war itself has become an interest because it has, ever since Vietnam, taken place in people's sitting rooms. And it's almost made people immune to shock. Think about how many times on the TV you actually watch the news and there are dead bodies lying in the street. And it says, oh, the following news broadcast might upset some people. Yes, you know, it is a dreadful thing, but people still sit and watch it because it is commonplace now to do this. So, if you like, we're all getting a daily dose of abomination and death delivered via the little box in the corner. It's not so little these days. So, if you like, armies almost become like the explorer type of tourist. They're going to places that perhaps are already tourist sites, but they are invading those places under very different circumstances, and society itself has been obliterated or changed beyond recognition from what it was before. So if you like, the armies, the soldiers going into a site of war are almost like explorers going into this new place. And they spend money when they're there. I mean, particularly if we happen to be talking about a war in an urban area, yeah, these soldiers there will actually go into the shops and buy things and actually spend money in places of war as well, just like tourists do. So, if you like, the armies where war is concerned go towards helping to create this image of this destination, this newly formed destination, perhaps out of a destination that had existed in the past. If you like, war tourism can add to a destination. It can destroy a lot, admittedly, but where tourism is concerned, the fact that a war has taken place somewhere can actually add or create an attraction. Weaver says that after about 30 years, the conversion of battle sites into attractions and the return of veterans as visitors results in a demand surplus. This war dividend then continues for an indefinite period into the future. So tourism itself doesn't happen during the war itself, but it certainly happens afterwards. And it is still possible to go to some places where civil war has been raging for years, places like Sri Lanka, Nepal, Israel. Tourism still takes place in these places, even though they are officially at war. It seems that war tourism is the moniker given to wars which are remembered during the lifetime of the visitor. So war tourism, the division between war tourism and dark tourism is that war tourism is visiting a site that has been a site of war during your own lifetime. Because what you're actually going to visit is that site of the war that you remember being displayed to you through your television set, through the newspaper stories, through friends that you had that were there. Heaven forbid that any of you were there. And then when all of those people have gone, it becomes dark tourism. Because the type of visitor has changed, and the type of visitor now is really an observer, not a participant. What Weber did was he came up with a distorted life cycle based on Butler's life cycle. Now, you remember this tourist destination life cycle that Butler created, where you have, following the S curve, you start off with exploration, then you get involvement, development, stagnation, rejuvenation, or decline, or consolidations in there too. And this is what happens over the lifetime of a destination if the destination just develops under normal circumstances. So Weaver took that Butler's destination life cycle and he looked at it where war was concerned, and it became distorted. So we have instability, collapse, exploration, early recovery, development, late development, the commemoration plateau, which runs along the top, adjustment, and stability. And so we'll just run through what each of these different ones mean. The first stage, the instability stage, if you follow this line that runs all the way through the quite straight line, that actually is to represent Butler's curve, okay? So the Butler curve at that point, I won't go back, would be in the sort of development stage. So there is tourism that's there. But in the distorted war destination life cycle, that period of instability is where your visitors actually reduce in numbers. So you had tourism, but because of the political situation, because war is imminent, people stop going there. So it becomes a very unstable climate as far as tourism is concerned. Only the very adventurous or those looking for the very cheap experiences will actually go there because everybody else is a bit scared. You don't want to get stranded somewhere where there's suddenly going to be a war. It's also at that stage that within the destination itself, you're going to begin to get things like shortages, riots in the street, political instability. And so there's a risk element that goes into creating this period of instability. It's down to the individual tourist to decide what they think of as an acceptable risk and whether they're actually going to go there. Then war breaks out, and you actually have this collapse. So this is the actual outbreak of hostilities. Tourist visitation bottoms out, and at the very, very best, you might get one or two very foolhardy adventure tourists who are actually going to make it to the site. So basically, collapse, outbreak of hostilities. The next stage at the bottom is when we have exploration. And this is what continues until the cessation of hostilities. You have no visitors. You only have the armies and the fighting that's taken place there. But even though there might not be any visitors, what is happening during that period of exploration is that the conditions which are conducive to future tourism are being laid and being established. War infrastructure, things such as roads, bridges, airports are being built because they're always built and destroyed during wars. But airports particularly, I mean, one of the reasons, remember, those of you doing foundations, that we looked at when we talked about transport, one of the reasons that transport grew with airlines after the war was because so many airports had been built during the war. And this is something that happens at that time. So you have all of these things. You have this infrastructure being put in. And this constant relaying of happening and war and what's going on through the television screen back to the people at home is also building up images. Now, those images, to a great extent, will be negative, but there will also be some positive images that come through, such as what a beautiful place. What a shame they're destroying it. Look at all of those fantastic buildings. Gosh, I never knew that there was all of this sort of wonderful stuff in the museum that they had there. Think about the Baghdad Museum that was ransacked with the present war on Iraq, and think about the things that we know went missing before we even knew that they were there. All of this is an image that is being developed of a particular destination. At the cessation of hostilities, we move into the period of early recovery. You can see it's just beginning to go up slightly there. And early early recovery is when we get lots of people like the adventure tourists coming in, the allocentric tourists, the families of missing soldiers going to see if they can find anything out about them, opportunists, people wondering whether they'll be able to make some money out of introducing tourism or any other sort of business or trade into a recovering war-torn area. So basically, as I say, it's early recovery, and it's normally some months after the peace process has been established. So within this stage, you have both positives and negatives. These tourists are going somewhere where there are probably still shortages, and the people in these areas are probably struggling to service the tourists, but they're very pleased that people are coming because they want that foreign exchange and they need the foreign money. But it's also because at this stage that sometimes tourism is actually built into the political recovery package as well. So that tourism is actually going to be put into the infrastructure and developed purposely to try and help the destination itself recover from the war that it's just been through. As we then move on, we have late recovery, which is where we have perhaps a few returning soldiers and their families coming to have a look at the sites of battle, etc. But very often, there's very little attraction or attention being given to the battlefields themselves at this stage. They are places that haven't been touristified. They are just as they were. And so quite often you'll find that these returners and the participants, they're interested to go there, but they don't really want to go there because it's still linked to reality. It's still too close, if you like. The battlefields themselves might also, of course, be just far too dangerous still at this stage. This could be that they're full of landmines. It could be that they're full of unexploded munitions, etc. We then, as we move forward, we're moving out of this box, the dotty box down there, and we're moving into the development stage. And this is the stage which is a grey area between war and dark tourism, this stage of development. It's about 20 years after the war is over. So it's not just at the end of the war, it's about 20 years later. And it's, if you like, it's the post-recovery period, when you begin to attain the same sort of numbers that you had before war broke out. So it might take 20 years to get back to getting those numbers in again. And you can see it's sort of pretty much level with instability, and you're continuing up the development stage of Butler's life circle as well. However, if you like, the growth shadows what would have happened had war never actually taken place. But the things that drive that growth are actually quite different. So, say somewhere like Beirut, for example, which has had several wars, but certainly Beirut was known as the Paris of the Mediterranean because it was such a beautiful city. And then there was the war back in the 70s and 80s that destroyed much of it. And they'd only just sort of really started building it again into this development stage when the Second War has now happened. But it does take a great deal of time to get to that stage again where you can begin to develop. But what people are then actually going to have a look at is actually quite different. Because you have war-related attractions. You have your battlefields, you have your cemeteries, you have your places which are mythologized by the story of what happened during the war. You have visits by former combatants, and a lot of those visitors are bringing their children. If you were in your early 20s when you went to war, you're in your mid-40s now, and you're going back and you're taking your kids with you to show them where Daddy fought during the war, etc. And so this type of attraction, this type of war attraction, actually gives great impetus to the growth of the destination. And as it says, battlefields of their youth become feasible and psychologically tolerable. And the majority, so it's to a great extent, this development is very important as far as things like interpretation and how the story is told. because it is the people who know the story who are actually going back to visit it. And then as we follow up that dotty line, we get into the period of late development. And once we've crossed Butler's Curve, where his destination is really beginning to get towards stagnation, we are passing through that into the period of late development in a war zone, which is really about 40 years after the end of the war. And so when we get that far on, the overall number of visitors has actually risen beyond what it would have been if it had just developed as a normal destination. So you are now beginning to get into that war dividend, where there are people who are actually going to this site because they're interested in the war attractions. That's actually one of the great pulls for them to actually go and visit. And this is when your war dividend begins to pay off. You've got your aging veteran market, augmented by the non-participant, the non-connected market. People just going to that destination because it's a nice place to go to. They're the people who might visit a battlefield, for example, but only as part of another tour that they happen to be on. It's not a specific purpose for being there. By this stage as well, places like the battlefields themselves look more like parks than battlefields. They have moved away from being dangerous places to visit. And you're also beginning to get involved in plans for commemorating the 50th anniversary of the war. By the time we get up to the commemoration plateau, that really starts with the 50th anniversary. The 50th anniversary is much more important than the 40th anniversary or the 60th anniversary. The 40th anniversary is still quite close to the war itself. But 50 being half a century has a certain psychological meaning to it. And it's also that if you're in your early 20s when you fought that war, you're in your early 70s now. And early 70s in this day and age is still relatively fit and healthy and youthful enough to want to go back and to visit. 60th anniversary, you're actually in your early 80s. And that is not going to be quite the same health-wise. You're beginning to get a much steeper drop-off or attrition of those old veterans. So the commemoration plateau takes place along a whole series of peaks. And the commemoration plateau will really pretty much be the same length as the war, because you are celebrating the things that happened during that war. And so during the whole year, for example, you will commemorate certain battles. But if the war was 5 years long, you'll actually find that you have peaks over the 5-year period. We've had this relatively recently with the Second World War and the different commemorations that have taken place over the last 5 years or so. That, the D-Day landings, 1940, the Battle of Britain, can't remember what year it was, but it was a bit later than that. And you have 50th anniversaries of all of these different things. And so, if you like, this is the peak of the cycle. This 50 years after the end of the war, when you've still got people coming back to visit, you have a lot more people coming back because they want to get involved in the events and the festivals that are taking place to do with that commemoration. So, as I say, it's also because perhaps reconciliation has taken place by this time. And so it's a very positive time to be in the place. You're remembering what happened before, but that period of time, that 50 years, has made a great deal of difference. And now it's a joyous occasion. Yes, memories of people and events, but it's a celebration. And then we move into adjustment, which is following the 50th anniversary, so 50 plus. So there's a decline in visitation. Levels return more to normal levels, pretty much like Gallipoli is now, if you like. That people will always go and visit. It's got a special place, but it's beyond knowing that your father was there. It might be your grandfather or your great-grandfather that was there, but you are detached from those people. It's when the last of those veterans die like Alec Campbell did a short time ago from Gallipoli, or the First World War, wasn't it? That you almost get into this period of mythology where you get a myth surrounding the place itself. And then eventually you get into this period of stability. So stability is when tourism is really by those who have no direct contact at all with the war attraction. It's open-ended. It has this mythical status that you can build up, and this is what we find if we look at places like the battlefields of Troy, for example, that was thousands of years ago, but it's still of interest to people. People still go and try and imagine what's taking place there. And if you like, it's at this stage when a site of this nature will become sacred. So quite different, perhaps, from what would have happened within a normal destination that hadn't had this war dividend. There you are. You can see that there's a list there about those different stages. And then I quite like this quote about Bosnia, which of course was just very recent. And this is the marketplace where the infamous mortar attack took place in February 1994. That's not long ago, that's 12 years ago. And yet it's the guide telling the coach party. 68 people were killed, 200 wounded, he says, as his attentive audience looks over his shoulder at the site of one of the most notorious incidents of the Bosnian War, nowadays a bustling square full of fruit and vegetable sellers. And I think in a way that sort of sums it up. It really sort of says that, yes, there were dreadful, dreadful things that happened here, but life goes on, and we'll always remember those happenings and hopefully learn from. Smith says that he suggests that war-related phenomena are the largest single category of tourist attractions. And to a certain extent, he could be right. But he says that there are different phases and different approaches that can be taken to this. He says the heroic phase are things like monuments, and that's true to a certain extent. If you think about the cenotaph, for example, you're remembering the fallen heroes. Remember the fallen, battlefields and military cemeteries. And that is a different emotion when you actually do go to a military cemetery and you can see the rows and rows and rows of white crosses stretching as far as the eye can see, and Stars of David, and sickles for the Muslims. Within a war cemetery, you will actually normally find that you have all of these people, and they will have the different symbol of their own religion on their memorial. I'll call it a cross, but it might not be. It might be a sickle, etc. Lest we forget, civilian impact sites, for example, Auschwitz, lest we forget, because we never, ever, ever want to do this again. When we were young, the nostalgic travel by veterans, oh, life was always better in those days. Even if it was fighting a war. You just need to talk to some people who made it through the Second World War, and they'll always tell you their diet was much better because they didn't eat sugar, and there was all of that camaraderie and the close community of sitting in the bomb shelters, etc. And reliving the past, reenactments. So all of these different types of attraction are people going through a different phase, if you like. There are some very serious management issues at dark tourist sites. Sternberg says, an icon is an object, person, or experience that has acquired added value through the commercial heightening of meaning. And he says that there are different stages for managing an iconic dark tourist attraction, bearing in mind just how sensitive these attractions actually are. First, he says that it needs to be staged. The visitor must see the dark tourism icon within its historic context, and they must be able to reach it. So, if you like, a lot of what is staged is tangible, that you need to be able to go and touch it or become part of that story. It's not the dark tourism attraction itself that becomes the icon. The icon is the event that happened to create that dark tourism. And it needs to be staged because for people to really understand it, for visitors to understand what happened, they almost have to touch it, quite literally. It's funny, for example, in the Tower of London, on Tower Green, which is where the people lost their heads, 6 people within the Tower of London, there is not a block, because that would be just too grisly, but there is a box on which the Beefeaters stand when they're giving their tour of the area. But this box looks like the block. And so it's almost something that people can touch, that people can go up, and it's not trying to make something false, and it's not having a representation of what was there, but it is something that adds just that little bit of reality. You can almost sort of see it, and you go and stand on the very spot where these people lost their heads. So it is something tangible, something that you can actually physically connect with. It needs to be arranged, so how the visitor sees it. The visitor needs to be comfortable. Remember, a lot of sites are in very difficult places to get to. So the customer has to go there, and instead of worrying about the blisters on their heels and the fact they haven't been able to buy water for 3 days, they actually go there and they feel comfortable, and their whole attention can therefore be on the events and the site and what took place during this sort of dark tourism period. There needs to be a place for quiet spiritual contemplation, because dark tourist sites do affect people. However hard and tough you might want to be, they do affect you emotionally. And human needs must be arranged in such a way that the essence of the quotidian does not overpower the uniqueness of the spiritual. So in other words, you need to be able to go and connect with the place. You don't want loads of interpretation. You don't want a lot of simulated objects around the place to try and make it look real. You actually want it to be quite simple so that you can actually go and connect with the place itself. It needs to be contextualized. It needs to be explained in the big picture. So, for example, 9/11 cannot really be explained in the context of 2 planes flying into 2 buildings. It can only really be explained in the context of the war on terror and the bigger world picture at that time. And it needs to be thematized. I hate that word. But basically, there will, with dark tourism, normally be a message of some sort. Those of you doing interpretation next semester, those of you who've already done it, will know that to give a theme is very connected with the interpreter's message. Now, the interpreter might want to make a message. They might want to talk about, human cruelty. People have been this cruel and will never be this cruel again. But on the other hand, very often with these dark tourist sites, the messages that are given are within the story of what's happened there. And people will make their own connections and will then walk away with their own messages, if you like, related to what has actually happened at that particular spot. But theming also obviously goes back to what we were talking about before. Whose history? Whose story? Who decides? And you can't get away from that. Postmodern phenomenon. Meaning has been replaced with spectacle, and sensation dominates value. This is the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And it's the Disneyfication and spectacle, despite having authentic features, upsets many people. The reason is that this is the Holocaust Memorial. Now, a memorial is a very serious place, and the Holocaust was a very serious event that took place. But what they've done here is that they have turned it into like a theme park. And so when you arrive, you're given a card that tells you the story, and you follow that person and their story all the way through. So one of the largest of all Holocaust-related attractions is the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., which has received an average of 2 million visitors each year since opening in 1993. A controversial feature of this museum is that visitors assume the identity of a Jewish citizen of Hitler's Germany upon entry and experience deportation and eventual extermination as they progress through the exhibits. While most visitors maintain a reverential attitude to the site, it's not clear whether the intended educational purposes are fulfilled. Many visitors, for example, throw their Jewish identity cards in the trash can when exiting the museum, while others complain that this role-playing trivializes the suffering of the actual victims. Some have questioned the relevance of having such a museum in a site far removed from the geographical context in which the events occurred. So huge, what is it that we're after here? What is it that we are actually trying to do with these dark tourism experiences. And particularly with something such as the Holocaust, which there are still people alive today who have memories of it and who went through that experience. And so how do you deal with it? Do you deal with it like this, where you are actually trying to touch the hearts and souls of people who are a very long way away? What they've done in Berlin is actually much more elegant. This is in Berlin, right next door to the Brandenburg Gate, and it is enormous, and it was opened last year. It stands on a 19,000 square metre patch of land, sandwiched between the East and West Berlin of the Cold War, and it's an undulating labyrinth of stone plinths. And the most important thing is there are no names on it. So it is not a memorial, it is not a it is a memorial, it is not a graveyard. And that was done particularly. So as visitors can move through the tilting featureless stones, each one a unique shape and size from any direction. There are no plaques, inscriptions or symbols along the way. The stones have been treated with an anti-graffiti agent that authorities hope will ward off vandals and neo-Nazi sympathisers to try and stop that from happening. And people like the architect, Peter Eisenman, said that he hoped that people would use this as a shortcut to work and a shortcut from one side to another, because it's so big, right there in the centre of Berlin. So far more site-related, even though obviously the concentration camps weren't in Berlin, it was all to do with Germany. And therefore, how do you deal with something that is on the same site as you? How do you deal with something that is on the same site as what happened, or that is a long geographical distance away? Does it give you the license to, if not trivialize something, certainly to change the way that the story is told, and perhaps change the results that you get from that? So interpretation in dark tourism is very important. It needs to be, if you're going to do interpretation, it needs to be authentic. You need to tell the right story. There needs to be a balanced view. You cannot take sides. You cannot really, I suppose, demonize a whole lot of people without telling their story as well. And it needs to be sensitive to the audience and the story. So that the audience who is looking at it, you don't want them all to be reduced to floods of tears and getting overly upset. You need to be sensitive to the feelings and to the emotions of both. So interpretation within a site of this nature is actually very, very difficult. And then we've got our own dark tourism site. And Port Arthur, penal colony, yes, it's what we talk about. People being imprisoned. And one of the things about Port Arthur is the beauty of the place. So it's one of the most striking aspects of the Port Arthur site is the beauty of the surrounding landscape and its contrast to the horror of the events and penal industrial system of 19th century convictism. By some accounts, the beautiful landscape works against the conservation and interpretation of the main messages and related historic and social values of the site. However, for some visitors, the serenity of the landscapes makes it difficult to imagine the brutality of the convict period. For others, that same serenity actually helps them reflect on the site's past. It really brings it home to it. And in the buildings such as the separate prison, where the convict experience is immediately felt, have the most potential for conveying historic experience. And there again, you take a card and you follow. It was Hamish Maxwell Stewart, those of you who know him, who teaches history, it was his idea for interpretation at Port Arthur. And you take a card and you follow the role of a convict. And nobody gets upset about that. And you have to ask why. If they get so upset about it in Washington at the Holocaust Museum, why don't they get upset about it at Port Arthur? And the probable explanations are time. The fact that time adds that barrier, like we were talking about with war tourism. When you step away from being able to personally remember things or have a knowledge connection with somebody who was involved in the event. So with somewhere like Port Arthur, these convicts happened a long time ago. And these people, their stories are told, and even though people who are related to them might be coming back and going round and looking at the place, they're They might be ancestors, but they're not necessarily known personally. And therefore, you can go around and you can look and you can be interested. And you don't mind following somebody's story. In fact, you think it's quite interesting. But look at what's in the bottom right-hand corner. The Broad Arrow Cafe and Martin Bryant. And they are not talked about at Port Arthur, despite the fact that the massacre that took place there is still the largest massacre of non-war related people anywhere in the world. It is not mentioned in the guidebooks. And in fact, the bit in the guidebook that is mentioned is please don't ask our staff, because too many of them are too closely related and knew the people who were involved. And so that, Port Arthur in a way, really sums up this whole notion of time and distance. And where dark tourism is concerned, the limits to which you can go at different periods during the history, moving away from the event that took place. And it is to do with emotion, and it is to do with personal connection with these dark tourism events. But I think it's an interesting subject. Thus, more references.